In this video, I'm going to show you how to draw fur with colored pencils. I will be going over the steps to layering fur as well as the structure components to drawing realistic fur. So the first thing you're going to want to do when you're drawing fur is get in a good base layer. And if you're using a reference photo, you're gonna have an easier time trying to get it to look realistic than you would without one. So what you want to do if you're using a reference photo is to look at the specific area that you're going to be working on. And this area may be something that is maybe a 1 square inch, maybe 2 square inches. It kind of varies depending on the subject you're working on and also depending on how your style is of drawing. But you want to get your base layer filled in the area that you're going to be working on. Usually I prefer to get in a base layer for the entire area of a specific color of fur. So with this cat, as an example, this cat is all the same color. But if I were drawing, say, a wolf or maybe a dog, or there's other cats too that have different kind of colors, like calico cats. Maybe we've got some white patches and then some other colors on them are orange or tabby looking. You want to pick an area and build your base layer on that specific area and fill in only that little area and leave all of the other parts out. Or in the case of a cat that's all the same color, like this cat that I've got drawing here, I wanted to fill in the entire area because that way I have a consistent transition of colors. Oftentimes, I typically draw in a couple hour sessions. I don't usually sit down and draw an entire drawing in one setting because I just don't have enough time in my adult life to do that. So if I were to start a base layer and get it all blended out and proceed to draw fur in that area with my fur layers next and build up the fur and get it complete. Then I go and decide to draw the rest of the cat maybe the next day or the day after that, depending on when I have some time to get around to it. I may have forgotten how I did the base layer, and depending on what you're drawing, you can have multiple combinations of base layer colors added to it to create your base layer. I mean, for this cat, it was relatively simple, but even for it being relatively simple, I may add what I think is a light layer of one color to kind of get the color right, but then I start adding another color in and I don't do it as light as I maybe did before, or I do it, way too light, and then I have to incorporate and add more. It's just easier if you can do the entire base layer for these areas that you're going to be working on all in one sitting. So that way you don't forget how you applied different colors. And then, of course, there are different colors that you can add to your base layers. And depending on which order you apply those colors, it can kind of change the way it looks. So you want to maintain consistency with these base layers in your drawing if you don't have time to do the whole drawing in one sitting. If you did it in one whole sitting, then of course you could just do all your base layers in one sitting. But so essentially getting this base layer in and getting the colors right is kind of really important in trying to build your fur layers. I mean, the whole drawing fur in itself is a gradual process to go through. You're not going to have everything perfect at every stage of your drawing process. You may have some things right and some things wrong. And through your drawing process, you're going to realize those mistakes and other things that are right. And you're going to kind of judge to see what you need to fix or change in order to get it to where it needs to be. And so by getting this base layer in, essentially what the base layer is, it is your highlights of your drawing. So in the reference photo, you want to pick out the lightest colors you're seeing for that specific area in the hairs that you're going to be drawing onto your drawing. And try to mimic the color that you're seeing for the highlighted hairs. And this is kind of hard to do. I mean, it's not easy for me sometimes. There's times when I struggle. For the most part, just give it your best shot. try to get it as accurate as possible, but maybe aim for something a little bit lighter than what you might think it is. Not, like significantly lighter, but try to get it close, but hopefully be on the lighter spectrum of getting it accurate. If you're on the darker spectrum, then you're going to have more problems for yourself trying to erase what you've got down and trying to not mess up any of the fur details you may work in later just to try and fix it. But so if you've got the layer a little bit lighter than what it really needs, once you start filling all those fur details and the rest of the fur layers, getting those shadows in there, then you're going to kind of notice if your highlighted base layer is too light or too dark. And of course, with always my work, I go too light instead of too dark. So it's easy for me to correct. Then all you're left with is taking, a couple of colors to darken out your highlights and get them down to the tones that they actually need to be. And the only painstaking process you have is trying to intricately put strokes into only the areas where the highlights are, trying not to go over your shadow fur layers that you've incorporated in. Once you have the base layer in, usually I draw my fur in kind of a 3 to 4 layer process, and it depends on what color of fur it is. And some colors of fur require different colors, whereas this cat is pretty easier to do in the fact that the fur color is relatively one solid color. There's not really a multitude of different colors going on in the fur of this cat, making it easier to achieve the color. So with that means that what I'll be doing is drawing my fur in kind of a layer process, of course, and usually I aim for trying to get my first couple of layers are going to be my midtones. So the first layer that I'll do, I usually pick a color that is going to be at least 5, maybe 6 or 7 shades darker. It depends on your colored pencils and the subject, of course, but at least 5 shades darker than what my base layer is. And I start working in the fur strokes at that point to get some of the mid-tonal values for the fur worked in. And I draw all of the fur as if I was trying to just draw fur in there. And then I will come back through and get in a second mid-tone layer. And usually this layer is a little bit darker, only by 2 to 3 shades than the last layer that I applied. And it's either darker because I push harder with my pencil and apply more pencil to the paper, making it darker, or I pick a shade that is just a couple of shades darker. And I work in some of those kind of, I would classify them as almost mid-tonal shadows. They're a little bit dark, but not quite dark enough to be considered the actual total darkest shadows of the fur. Then once I've got those two in, usually I'll go through with, in this case for this cat, it's black. Other animals, it might be a different color. I usually always save black for last. I don't just go in and work in getting shadows with black initially, because black is a shade, it's not a color, and you're going to lose out in some of the depth to your drawing if you're trying to just do all of your shadows with black. It will just look very unnatural. Don't do that. Try to save your black for last. In the instance of this cat, however, this cat is gray, so I'm going to be using black for this cat earlier on than I would with other fur types. Then what I'll do is the first stage of using the last couple of shadow layers. In this case, it is black. I'll go through and add a layer of shadows with this black, and I won't press very hard. I'm not trying to get the shadows to be super, super dark. I'm trying to just kind of shape out the fur. So I'm trying to pick out certain sections of the fur, which I'm going to turn into clumps. And I'm going to put these shadows in there and try to make those strokes not so precise and, how do you say it? Sharp or pointy. I want to just build these shadows as kind of dull, shadowy shapes. I don't want to draw individual hairs with it at this point. So once I get that layer built up in there, then I'll come back through with the final layer of shadows, which of course most times is black, but in the case of this cat, I've already used black. So now at this point, I'm going to try and draw all the individual darkest shadows. So I'll be working in all of the kind of shapely shadows, the ones that aren't like looking like individual hairs, that they're just kind of shadowy shapes. I'll get those in there, and then I'll also work in the individual shadow strokes that look like hairs. And now on to the actual how to draw your fur. This, I've already kind of talked about kind of the general makeup of the layering structure to your fur, or at least how I layer my fur. But to actually draw fur, you need to understand that there are some kind of what I call key components to drawing fur. And, you know, it's not just drawing a bunch of lines in changing their direction. It's a lot more complicated than you may think. When I initially embarked on learning to draw fur, it's way more complicated than I initially thought. And it's taken me quite a while to, you know, it's one thing to know what to do, it's another thing to actually be able to think about it and talk about it. But so what I prefer to call the key components to drawing fur is going to be pattern, repetition, and clumping. And these are just 3. But the first thing you want to do is kind of get yourself into being comfortable drawing in a pattern. It might be easy for you to practice on just a sheet of paper that's not even a drawing. Try to draw some individual strokes of what you think would be how to build up fur structure. And with each of these individual strokes, what you want to focus on is trying to draw the hairs in just slightly different directions. If you look at the fur on this cat, as you see me drawing it, each one of these individual hair strokes that I'm adding in there, they're not all straight. Like most of them are crisscrossing over each other just a little bit, or even all the ones that you might think are straight. If you relook at it again, you'll notice that none of them are straight. They're all kind of just slightly curved a little bit. Usually when I'm drawing my strokes, I start off the hair straight, but then halfway through I kind of just slightly curve it a little way to the right or a little way to the left, and this creates the realism to fur. It's not straight at all. If you're trying to draw straight lines and you're drawing a bunch of strokes that are all uniformly in the same way, you're going to come out with fur that looks like really unrealistic straw. And you don't want to do that. So then the next step after you've kind of learned how to draw the individual hairs is to get in the habit of drawing this in a repetitive pattern. So you can draw a series of like 4 or 5 hairs, and every time you draw a new little like micro section of hairs onto your actual drawing, this is what I'm doing with my drawing. Even though this is a little sped up, it may be, you know, kind of hard to see exactly how I'm doing this, but I'm drawing one hair off to the left, one hair slightly off to the right, another hair maybe crisscrossing over the last one, and then 2 or 3 more kind of almost side by side if I'm working in a lateral direction, or one's on top of the other if I'm working more in a vertical direction. And I'm trying to draw them overlapping each other because hairs, they just clump together. They aren't just, what's the word? They aren't just solitary, having only one hair sticking out and then maybe, you know, just little millimeters, there's another one kind of sticking out in the same direction, but nothing in between. That's how you end up with straw. That is not realistic fur at all. And with this patterns of repetition, I'm trying to really overlap my fur. And this can get kind of confusing, and I know one of the mistakes that I see a lot of people making is that they don't build enough structure with their fur. There's not enough layering going on. It's a process of building up lighter layers and then darker layers to get your fur to look really full and lush instead of thin and sparse with too much contrast between the highlights and shadows. That's because you haven't gotten enough mid-tone layers in there to help you with your fur structure. So then after repetition, then we have clumping. And I kind of briefly talked about this just a little bit ago, is that when I'm adding kind of I even do this a little bit with the mid-tone layers sometimes. It depends on the animal, and it depends on their fur. There are other animals who have way more clumping to their fur than other ones. Some animals have more smooth fur. But with clumping, all fur tends to have structure to it. So there are certain clumps that clump together. If you could think of a bison as an example, they have tons and tons of fur that clumps together. And when those furs clump together in these big clumps that you could probably even grab with your fist because bison are huge, but all of the areas around it are extremely shadowed because all those hairs are pulled together, exposing the inside part of the other hairs in the surrounding area. So when you draw your shadow layers in, you're not just trying to draw straw looking fur, you're trying to just get the shadows. You need to focus on drawing fur as shapes. You're trying to mimic a pattern that you're seeing maybe in a reference photo and copy that onto your drawing. You're not drawing fur, you're trying to draw patterns. That's what you need to try and get through your mind as you're trying to draw fur. Stop thinking about it for what it is and think about what you're seeing. Or, if you're drawing out of your head, then it's a process of trying to master your fur building process on, doing a bunch of sketches and practice drawings to get it really down into your head on how to draw it. And it's going to take a long time to master drawing all of these components, pattern, repetition, and clumping before you're able to do that without looking at a reference. But essentially, what you'll end up having in your head is oftentimes you just have an image in your mind and then you're trying to just copy that image. But as long as you know what the basic makeup of fur is and what it looks like because you've studied reference photos, then it just becomes that much easier for you. So where there are about 2 or 3 hairs, there are usually 5 or 6 others with it. There aren't just 1 or 2 little hairs sticking out and then all hairs are sticking out in that same kind of way in a spiral pattern. That's not natural. Fur likes to clump together. You can learn more fur drawing tips from the top right video, and you can also learn to draw wildlife and pets with colored pencils from my real-time 1 to 15 hour drawing tutorials with a voiceover of tips and explanations over on my Patreon. Signing up gives you instant access to a growing library of tutorials, and new ones are added each month. I'll have a link in the video description. Thanks so much for watching. See you in the next video.